Welcome. Tonight, we are going to talk about Sitting Bull. In the vast expanse of the North American Great Plains, where the prairie grass stretched endlessly beneath expansive skies, and where the buffalo once roamed in numbers that seemed infinite, there lived a man whose name would become synonymous with Native American resistance, wisdom, and dignity. His name was Sitting Bull, though he was born as Jumping Badger, and his life would span one of the most tumultuous and transformative periods in the history of the indigenous peoples of North America. Tonight, we will journey through the remarkable life of this Hunkpapa Lakota leader, from his birth in the early 1830s to his tragic death in 1890, exploring not just the warrior and chief that history remembers, but the man, the visionary, and the spiritual leader who sought to preserve a way of life that was rapidly disappearing. Sitting Bull was born around 1831, though the exact year remains uncertain, as the Lakota people did not keep written records in the manner of European societies. He entered the world along the Grand River in what is now South Dakota, in a time when the Lakota Nation was at the height of its power and influence across the northern plains. His father was Returns Again, also known as Jumping Bull, a respected warrior and leader within the Hunkpapa band of the Lakota Sioux. His mother was Her Holy Door, and he was born into a society that valued courage, generosity, wisdom, and spiritual connection above all else. The child who would become Sitting Bull was initially named Jumping Badger, a name that reflected the spirited nature of his early years. He grew up in a world that was rich with tradition, where every aspect of life was infused with spiritual meaning, and where the relationship between the people and the land was one of deep reciprocity and respect. The Lakota way of life revolved around the buffalo, which provided not just food, but clothing, shelter, tools, and spiritual sustenance. The annual cycle of the seasons dictated the movements of the people, from summer camps where the great sun dance ceremonies were held, to winter camps in sheltered valleys where families gathered close against the bitter cold of the plains winter. As a young boy, Jumping Badger learned the skills that would define his life. He was taught to ride horses with extraordinary skill, a necessity for a people who had adopted the horse with remarkable rapidity after its reintroduction to North America by Spanish colonizers. The Lakota had become perhaps the most formidable light cavalry the world had ever seen, and young boys learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Jumping Badger learned to hunt, to track, to read the signs of nature, and to live in harmony with the rhythms of the natural world. He learned the stories of his people, the complex kinship systems that bound the various Lakota bands together, and the spiritual practices that gave meaning and purpose to existence. But he also learned the ways of war. The Great Plains in the mid-19th century was not a peaceful place. Various Native American nations competed for territory, resources, and prestige through a complex system of raids, counter-raids, and occasional larger conflicts. The Lakota themselves had only relatively recently moved onto the plains from the woodlands of Minnesota, displacing or absorbing other peoples in the process. Their traditional enemies included the Crow, the Pawnee, the Shoshone, and various other plains tribes. Warfare among the plains peoples was governed by elaborate codes of honor and rarely involved the kind of total warfare that characterized European conflicts. But it was nonetheless a central part of life for young men seeking to prove their courage and earn status within their communities. Jumping Badger was only 10 years old when he first accompanied a war party against the Crow. This was not unusual. Boys often accompanied war parties as observers and helpers, learning the skills they would need as warriors. During this raid, the young boy showed remarkable courage. When he spotted a Crow warrior, he charged forward on his pony and struck the enemy with a coop stick, an act of bravery that counted among the highest honors in plains warfare. Counting coup, touching an enemy in battle, required far more courage than killing from a distance, and it was the measure by which warriors were judged. His father, returns again, was so proud of his son's bravery that he gave the boy a new name. No longer would he be called Jumping Badger. From that day forward, he would be known as Tatanka Iyotanka, which translates to English as Sitting Bull. The name conjured the image of a buffalo bull sitting on its haunches, immovable, stubborn, and powerful. It was a name that would prove prophetic, for the man who bore it would indeed become immovable in his defense of his people and their way of life. As Sitting Bull grew into young manhood, he distinguished himself not only as a warrior, but as a man of unusual spiritual depth and wisdom. He participated in the traditional coming-of-age ceremonies of his people, including vision quests where young men would go alone into the wilderness, fasting and praying, seeking guidance from the spirits. These vision quests were central to Lakota spirituality, and the visions received during these ordeals would guide a person throughout their life. Sitting Bull's visions were powerful and would mark him as a man touched by the sacred, a Wikasawakan, a holy man. By his early 20s, Sitting Bull had already earned considerable respect within the Hunkpapa band. He had counted numerous coups against enemy tribes, had participated in successful horse raids, and had demonstrated the 4 cardinal virtues that the Lakota held most sacred: bravery, fortitude, generosity, and wisdom. He was also becoming known for his skills as a hunter. The buffalo hunt was not just an economic activity for the Lakota. It was a sacred ritual, a test of courage and skill, and a source of great prestige. A successful hunter who could provide for his extended family and share generously with those who had less was highly valued in Lakota society. Sitting Bull was also composing songs, for the Lakota were a people who expressed their deepest thoughts and emotions through song and poetry. He sang of his deeds in battle, of the beauty of the natural world, of his love for his people, and of his spiritual experiences. These songs would be remembered and sung by others, carrying his reputation far beyond his immediate band. In a non-literate society, songs and stories were the means by which history was preserved and transmitted, and a man whose deeds were worthy of song achieved a kind of immortality. In his mid-20s, Sitting Bull became a member of several important warrior societies. The Lakota, like many Plains tribes, organized their warriors into societies that served both military and social functions. These societies had their own songs, dances, regalia, and codes of conduct. Sitting Bull joined the Strong Hearts, one of the most prestigious of these societies, and would eventually become a leader within the group. These warrior societies maintained discipline, organized communal hunts and raids, and served as the military force of the band. It was during these years that Sitting Bull began to emerge not just as a warrior, but as a leader. Leadership among the Lakota was not hereditary in the way it was in European monarchies. While being born into a respected family certainly helped, leadership had to be earned through demonstrated courage, generosity, wisdom, and the ability to persuade others. Chiefs were chosen by consensus, and they led by example and persuasion rather than by command. A chief who lost the respect of his people simply ceased to be a chief, as people would stop following him. Sitting Bull demonstrated all the qualities that made for respected leadership. He was extraordinarily brave in battle, but he was also generous to a fault, frequently giving away horses, buffalo robes, and other valuable possessions to those in need. This generosity was not seen as foolishness, but as a cardinal virtue. A leader was expected to be generous, to think of the welfare of the entire community rather than accumulating personal wealth. Sitting Bull embodied this ideal throughout his life, often living in poverty himself because he had given away everything he had. He was also demonstrating wisdom beyond his years. He participated in council meetings, where the important decisions affecting the band were made through long discussions and consensus. He listened carefully to the words of the elders, learned from their experience and wisdom, and began to contribute his own insights. He was developing a reputation as a man who thought deeply about the welfare of his people and who could see beyond the immediate to the long-term consequences of actions and decisions. Around this time, in the late 1850s, Sitting Bull took his first wife. He would eventually have multiple wives over his lifetime, as was customary and practical among the Lakota, where polygamy was accepted and where having multiple wives was seen as a sign of a man's ability to provide for an extended family. His wives would bear him several children, though many of his children would die young, a common tragedy in a time and place where infant and childhood mortality was high. Sitting Bull was also deepening his spiritual practices. He continued to seek visions, to participate in the sacred ceremonies of his people, including the Sun Dance, the most important religious ceremony of the Plains tribes. The Sun Dance was held annually during the summer, when the various bands of the Lakota would come together in a great encampment. It was a time of socializing, trading, arranging marriages, and renewing kinship bonds. But at the heart of the gathering was the dance itself, a sacred ritual of sacrifice and renewal. The Sun Dance involved dancers who would pierce their chest or back muscles with wooden skewers attached to rawhide thongs tied to a central pole. The dancers would then dance, pulling against the thongs until the skewers tore free, offering their flesh and blood as a sacrifice to the Great Spirit, praying for the welfare of their people. It was an ordeal of extraordinary pain and endurance, and those who completed the dance earned great respect. Sitting Bull participated in the Sun Dance many times throughout his life, and his willingness to endure such suffering for the sake of his people was further proof of his spiritual depth and commitment. But even as Sitting Bull was rising to prominence within Hunkpapa society, the world around him was changing in ways that would eventually destroy the traditional Lakota way of life. The United States was expanding westward at an unprecedented rate. The California Gold Rush of 1849 had sent thousands of Americans across the plains, and though most passed through quickly, their presence was felt. The buffalo, which had once seemed infinite in number, were beginning to decline as commercial hunting increased. Diseases brought by European settlers, including smallpox, measles, and cholera, were devastating Native American populations who had no immunity to these foreign illnesses. The United States government, driven by the doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined by God to expand across the continent, was increasingly coming into conflict with the indigenous peoples who occupied the land. Treaties were signed and broken with bewildering frequency. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, for instance, had attempted to establish peace between the United States and various Plains tribes, defining territories and guaranteeing safe passage for travelers. But the terms of the treaty were vague. The different sides had different understandings of what had been agreed to, and violations were frequent on both sides. By the late 1850s and early 1860s, tensions were rising. The Santee Dakota, eastern relatives of the Lakota, rose in rebellion in Minnesota in 1862, driven to desperation by broken treaty promises, delayed annuity payments, and starvation. The uprising was brutally suppressed, and in the aftermath, 38 Dakota men were hanged in the largest mass execution in United States history. This event sent shockwaves through all the Dakota and Lakota peoples, and many refugees from the uprising fled west to join their relatives on the plains, bringing with them tales of betrayal and violence. Sitting Bull, now in his 30s, was becoming increasingly prominent as both a warrior and a political leader. He had fought in numerous engagements against traditional enemies like the Crow and the Assiniboine, and he was also beginning to encounter American soldiers. The first major conflict between Sitting Bull's people and the United States occurred in 1863, when General Henry Sibley led a punitive expedition against the Dakota and Lakota in retaliation for the Minnesota Uprising. The battles that followed were the first significant encounters between Sitting Bull and the United States military. In several engagements, including the Battle of Dead Buffalo Lake and the Battle of Stony Lake, Sitting Bull fought with distinction, demonstrating not only personal courage, but also tactical acumen. He was wounded multiple times during these campaigns, including a serious injury to his hip that would cause him pain for the rest of his life. But these wounds only added to his prestige, serving as visible proof of his courage and willingness to sacrifice for his people. The 1860s were a tumultuous decade for the Lakota people. Even as the United States was tearing itself apart in the Civil War, the expansion into the West continued. Gold was discovered in Montana, and soon a new wave of miners and settlers were traversing Lakota territory. The Bozeman Trail, which cut through the heart of prime hunting grounds, became a particular point of contention. The trail was built to provide a shorter route to the Montana goldfields, but it ran directly through the Powder River country, one of the last great buffalo hunting territories. A Lakota war leader named Red Cloud led a determined campaign to close the Bozeman Trail, attacking wagon trains and military posts. This conflict, known as Red Cloud's War, lasted from 1866 to 1868 and resulted in one of the few clear victories for Native Americans over the United States military. Sitting Bull participated in this conflict, though Red Cloud, an Oglala Lakota, was the primary leader. The high point of the war was the Fetterman Fight in December 1866, when a force of 80 American soldiers under Captain William Fetterman was lured into an ambush and annihilated. It was the worst military defeat for the United States in the West up to that time. The Fetterman disaster shocked the United States and eventually led to a new round of negotiations. The result was the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which is considered by many to be the high point of Lakota sovereignty. The treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, encompassing all of present-day South Dakota west of the Missouri River, including the sacred Black Hills. It guaranteed that this territory would belong to the Lakota forever, or at least as long as the grass should grow and the water flow, in the flowery language of the treaty. It also established that no white persons would be permitted to enter the reservation without the consent of the Indians, and it recognized the Powder River country as unceded Indian territory where the Lakota could continue to hunt. Red Cloud, the principal leader of the war, signed the treaty and agreed to move to an agency on the reservation, accepting the annuities and rations that the government promised in exchange for peace. But Sitting Bull did not sign. He was deeply suspicious of the Americans and their promises. He had seen too many treaties broken, too many promises unfulfilled. He did not believe that the Americans would honor this treaty any more than they had honored previous agreements, and he was not ready to give up the free-roaming life of the plains to settle on a reservation and become dependent on government handouts. Instead, Sitting Bull chose to remain in the unceded territory, living the traditional life. He was not alone in this choice. Many Lakota, including other prominent leaders like Crazy Horse and Gall, chose to remain free. These bands, often called the non-treaty Indians by the Americans, continued to follow the buffalo, to conduct the sun dance and other sacred ceremonies, and to resist any encroachment on their territory. They lived primarily in the Powder River and Yellowstone River country, in what is now Montana and Wyoming, far from the agencies and the reach of American authority. During this period, Sitting Bull's stature continued to grow. In the early 1870s, he was recognized as a principal chief, not just of the Hunkpapa Band, but of all the Lakota peoples who chose to remain free. This was an unusual honor, as the Lakota were traditionally organized into autonomous bands, each with its own chiefs and councils. But the crisis facing the people called for unprecedented unity, and Sitting Bull's courage, wisdom, spiritual power, and uncompromising stance against American encroachment made him the natural choice to lead this confederation. Sitting Bull was not a chief in the traditional sense of commanding armies. His power came from his ability to persuade, to inspire, and to articulate a vision of resistance. He was a gifted orator, able to move people with his words. He spoke of the sacred duty to preserve the Lakota way of life, of the importance of remaining free, of the spiritual connection between the people and the land. He reminded people of the broken promises and betrayals of the Americans, and perhaps most importantly, he embodied the qualities that the Lakota most admired: courage, generosity, wisdom, and spiritual power. Life in the unceded territory during the early 1870s was both glorious and precarious. The buffalo were still relatively plentiful in this remote region, and the free-roaming bands could still live much as their ancestors had lived. They moved with the seasons, following the buffalo herds, conducting their sacred ceremonies, raiding enemy tribes, and raising their children in the traditional ways. But they were also under increasing pressure. The United States government wanted all Indians on reservations, where they could be more easily controlled and where their land could be opened to white settlement. The Army conducted periodic expeditions into the unceded territory, ostensibly to protect travelers and survey routes for railroads, but also to intimidate and pressure the free bands to come into the agencies. In 1872 and 1873, the Northern Pacific Railroad sent survey expeditions through Lakota territory, protected by Army troops under the command of Colonel David Stanley and Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. These expeditions were seen as grave threats by the Lakota, for the railroads represented the final destruction of their way of life. The Iron Horse, as they called it, would bring unlimited numbers of settlers, would fragment the buffalo herds, and would make it impossible to live in the old ways. Sitting Bull personally led several attacks against these survey expeditions. In August 1872, near the Yellowstone River, Sitting Bull and a party of warriors engaged soldiers in a skirmish. During a lull in the fighting, Sitting Bull calmly walked out into the open ground between the two forces, sat down, and began to smoke his pipe. He called for other warriors to join him, and a few brave men did so. Under fire from the soldiers, Sitting Bull sat and smoked calmly, then carefully cleaned his pipe, stood up, and walked back to the Lakota lines. It was a magnificent display of courage, of the kind that earned a warrior immortal fame. It showed his complete contempt for the soldiers and for danger itself. But even as Sitting Bull and his followers resisted, the pressures on them were mounting from all sides. The buffalo herds were declining at an alarming rate. Commercial hunters, equipped with powerful rifles and motivated by the market for buffalo hides, were slaughtering the animals by the millions. The railroads facilitated this slaughter by providing transportation for the hides to eastern markets. The United States Army and government officials actively encouraged the killing of the buffalo, recognizing that destroying the buffalo would destroy the Plains Indians' independence and force them onto reservations. General Phil Sheridan, commander of the military division of the Atchatichatis, Missouri, allegedly said that the buffalo hunters had done more in 2 years to settle the Indian question than the Army had done in 30. The crisis came to a head in 1874 when gold was discovered in the Black Hills. The Black Hills, Pahasapa in Lakota, were sacred to the Lakota people. They were the center of the world, the place of spiritual power, the birthplace of the Lakota Nation in their creation stories. The Fort Laramie Treaty had guaranteed that the Black Hills were part of the Great Sioux Reservation and that no white people would enter without permission. But the discovery of gold made this promise meaningless. The gold was discovered by an expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, whose forces entered the Black Hills ostensibly to scout locations for a new fort, but in reality to confirm rumors of gold. When Custer's expedition reported finding gold, thousands of miners rushed to the Black Hills, trespassing on Lakota land in direct violation of the treaty. The Army made token efforts to keep the miners out, but it was half-hearted at best. The government wanted the Black Hills, both for the gold and for the symbolism of finally conquering the Lakota. The United States government attempted to purchase the Black Hills from the Lakota. A commission was sent to the reservation in 1875 to negotiate a sale. They offered $6 million for the hills, or they offered to lease mining rights for $400,000 per year. But the Lakota refused. The Black Hills were not for sale at any price. They were sacred. They were home. They were the heart of Lakota country. Sitting Bull, though he did not attend the council himself, sent a message that was clear and unequivocal. The Black Hills would never be sold. Frustrated by the Lakota's refusal to sell the Black Hills, the United States government decided on a different approach. In November 1875, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs sent out an order. All Lakota must report to the agencies by January 31, 1876, or they would be considered hostile and subject to military action. This order was problematic on multiple levels. First, it was issued in winter, when travel across the frozen plains was extremely difficult and dangerous. Second, it demanded that the Lakota give up their treaty rights to hunt in the unceded territory. Third, many of the free-roaming bands never received the order, as they were scattered across a vast territory with no regular communication with the agencies. Sitting Bull and the other free-roaming bands had no intention of complying with this order in any case. They had committed no hostilities. They were living within the territory guaranteed to them by treaty. The order was a transparent pretext to justify military action against them and to force them onto the reservation so that the Black Hills could be seized. When the deadline passed, and most of the free bands had not reported to the agencies, the Army was given authorization to begin a campaign to force them in. The stage was set for the most famous military campaign in the history of the American West, the Great Sioux War of 1876. 3 columns of soldiers were organized to converge on the Powder River and Yellowstone country, where the free-roaming bands were known to be. One column, under General George Crook, would march north from Fort Fetterman in Wyoming. Another column, under Colonel John Gibbon, would march east from Fort Ellis in Montana. The third column, under General Alfred Terry, would march west from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. This column included the 7th Cavalry Regiment under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. The plan was for these 3 columns to trap the Lakota and Cheyenne bands between them and force them back to the agencies. But the army had made a critical miscalculation. They believed that the free-roaming bands would scatter and flee when confronted by military force, as they had often done in the past. They did not anticipate that this time, the Indians would stand and fight. They did not anticipate that Sitting Bull, through his spiritual leadership and vision, would unite the various bands into an unprecedented concentration of force. In the spring of 1876, as the grass greened and the ponies grew strong on fresh forage, the free-roaming bands began to gather. Hunkpapa, Oglala, Minneconjou, Sans Arc, Brule, Blackfeet Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and even some Arapaho came together in a massive encampment. This was not just a war camp, it was a gathering of the people to celebrate their way of life, to conduct the sacred sun dance, and to affirm their determination to remain free. The camp moved across the Powder River and Rosebud Creek country, growing larger each day as more people arrived from the agencies. By June, it was one of the largest gatherings of Plains Indians ever recorded, with perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 people and an estimated 2,000 warriors. In early June, the combined camps gathered along Rosebud Creek in Montana Territory for the Sun Dance. This Sun Dance would prove to be one of the most significant spiritual events in Lakota history. Sitting Bull, as the spiritual leader, participated in the dance with unusual intensity. He had his adopted brother, Jumping Bull, cut 100 small pieces of flesh from his arms, 50 from each arm, as a sacrifice. Then Sitting Bull danced, staring at the sun, without food or water, for 2 days and 2 nights. Finally, near the point of complete exhaustion, he experienced a powerful vision. In his vision, Sitting Bull saw soldiers falling into the Indian camp like grasshoppers falling from the sky. He heard a voice saying, "I give you these because they have no ears." The meaning was clear. The soldiers would not listen to reason or justice, so they would be given to the Lakota as a gift. It was a prophecy of a great victory. When Sitting Bull shared his vision, it electrified the camp. The people were filled with confidence and spiritual certainty. They believed that the Great Spirit was with them, that they would be victorious. The prophecy began to come true almost immediately. On June 17, 1876, General George Crook's column, advancing north from Wyoming, encountered the combined Lakota and Cheyenne forces near the Rosebud Creek. In a day-long battle, the Indians, led by war chiefs like Crazy Horse, fought Crook's forces to a standstill and eventually forced them to retreat. Crook withdrew to his base camp in Wyoming to await reinforcements and played no further part in the campaign. The first of the 3 converging army columns had been defeated. After the Battle of the Rosebud, the great camp moved west, crossing the divide between the Rosebud and the Little Bighorn River. They camped along the Little Bighorn in late June 1876, in a lush valley with good grass for the horses, clear water, and abundant game. The camp stretched for nearly 3 miles along the west bank of the river, divided into the circles of the various bands. At the north end was the Cheyenne Circle, then the Oglala, the Brule, the Sans Arc, the Minneconjou, and at the south end, the Hunkpapa, Sitting Bull's own band. Sitting Bull, now in his mid-40s, was not personally planning to fight in any battle that might come. He had been badly wounded in the previous year in a fight with the Crow and was still recovering. His role was that of the spiritual leader and supreme chief, not that of a war leader in the immediate tactical sense. The actual leadership of the warriors in battle would fall to men like Crazy Horse, Gall, and other prominent war chiefs. But Sitting Bull's spiritual and political leadership was what had brought all these people together, and his vision had given them confidence. On June 25, 1876, a beautiful summer day, the camp was attacked. It was Custer and the 7th Cavalry, the second of the three army columns. Custer had located the massive Indian camp and, in an act of either incredible courage or foolhardy arrogance, decided to attack immediately rather than wait for reinforcements from the other columns. He divided his regiment into 3 battalions, sending Captain Frederick Benteen to scout to the south, ordering Major Marcus Reno to attack the south end of the camp, while he led the largest force to attack from the north. The attack began with Reno's charge into the southern end of the camp, the Hunkpapa Circle. The initial assault created panic, with warriors scrambling for their weapons and women and children fleeing for safety. Sitting Bull, true to his role as a leader concerned with the welfare of his people, did not rush into battle himself, but instead helped organize the evacuation of the women, children, and elderly to safety in the hills. He also gathered his weapons and mounted his horse, but his primary concern was the safety of the non-combatants. But the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors recovered quickly from the initial surprise. Led by Gall and other chiefs, they counterattacked Reno's forces with such ferocity that the soldiers broke and retreated across the river to the bluffs on the east bank, where they dug in and prepared for a siege. This part of the battle was essentially over within half an hour. Meanwhile, Custer had led his battalion along the bluffs on the east side of the river, apparently planning to attack the camp from the north end or to trap the Indians between his force and Reno's. But the warriors, having routed Reno, now turned their full attention to Custer. Led by Crazy Horse and other war leaders, thousands of warriors swarmed toward Custer's position. Custer's battalion, numbering about 210 men, found itself surrounded on a ridgeline later known as Custer Hill or Last Stand Hill. What followed was a complete annihilation. Outnumbered by perhaps 10 to 1, and caught in terrain that offered no defensive advantages, Custer and every man under his immediate command was killed. The battle probably lasted less than an hour, possibly as little as 20 minutes. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors were armed with repeating rifles in many cases, while the soldiers were armed with single-shot carbines. The Indians were mounted on fast ponies, highly motivated and fighting to protect their families. The soldiers were exhausted from a long march, confused about what was happening, and probably terrified. Sitting Bull did not personally participate in the killing of Custer's men. He was occupied at the other end of the camp protecting the non-combatants and elderly. But it was his vision that had predicted this victory, his leadership that had brought the people together, his spiritual power that had given the warriors confidence. In the Lakota way of seeing things, Sitting Bull was as much the architect of this victory as any of the warriors who wielded weapons. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, known to the Lakota as the Battle of the Greasy Grass, was the greatest military victory ever achieved by Native Americans over the United States Army. It was a complete and devastating defeat for Custer and the 7th Cavalry. But it was also, though the Indians did not realize it at the time, the beginning of the end for the free-roaming way of life. The American public was shocked and outraged by news of Custer's defeat, which arrived just as the nation was celebrating its centennial. The defeat came to be seen as a national humiliation that demanded revenge. The Army's response was massive and immediate. More troops were poured into the region. The three-column strategy was abandoned in favor of a relentless pursuit of the Indian bands. The great camp that had gathered for the Little Bighorn broke up after the battle, as was customary, with the various bands scattering to hunt and to avoid military pursuit. But they found that there was nowhere to hide. Wherever they went, soldiers followed. Sitting Bull led his band north, toward the Yellowstone River and beyond, seeking refuge in the one place where American soldiers might not follow: Canada. Other bands tried to return to the agencies, hoping that they could surrender and be allowed to live in peace. But the army was in no mood for mercy. Colonel Nelson Miles pursued the Indians relentlessly through the fall and winter of 1876–77, attacking camps, destroying food supplies, and forcing surrender after surrender. The winter of 1876–77 was brutal. The free-roaming bands were harried constantly, unable to hunt properly, running low on ammunition and food. The buffalo, already scarce, were even harder to find with soldiers in constant pursuit. Children and elderly people were dying from cold and hunger. One by one, the bands gave up and returned to the agencies to surrender. Even Crazy Horse, the great war leader, surrendered in May 1877, bringing nearly 1,000 Oglala Lakota into the Red Cloud Agency. But Sitting Bull refused to surrender. In May 1877, he led his band, along with some Minneconjou and Sans Arc people who had joined him, across the border into Canada, known to the Lakota as the Grandmother's Country, a reference to Queen Victoria. In all, about 5,000 Lakota crossed into Canada, seeking refuge from American military power. The Canadian government, represented by the Northwest Mounted Police, gave the Lakota permission to stay, but made it clear that they would not be given reservations or annuities. They could stay as long as they kept the peace, but they would have to support themselves by hunting. For several years, this arrangement worked. The Lakota found buffalo north of the border and were able to live much as they had before, though in greatly reduced circumstances. Sitting Bull became an international figure during his time in Canada. American officials made several attempts to persuade him to return and surrender, most notably in a meeting with General Alfred Terry in October 1877. But Sitting Bull refused all offers, making it clear that he did not trust the American government and would not return as long as there was any possibility of freedom. He told the commissioners, "For 64 years you have persecuted my people. What have we done that you should want us to stop? We have done nothing. It is all the people on your side that have started us to do all these depredations." Life in Canada was difficult, however. The buffalo, already declining south of the border, were scarce in Canada as well. The Canadian government, while allowing the Lakota to stay, did not want them to become a permanent presence and did nothing to help them. The Northwest Mounted Police, while generally treating the Lakota fairly, kept pressure on them to return to the United States. Other Canadian Native peoples, particularly the Cree and the Blackfeet, resented the presence of the Lakota, who were competing for the same scarce resources. As the years passed, conditions grew worse. The buffalo were disappearing even from the remote regions of Canada. The Lakota were reduced to near starvation. People began to drift back across the border, accepting the reservation life that they had fought so hard to avoid. Sitting Bull's following dwindled. By 1881, only about 200 people remained with him in Canada, mostly from his immediate family and the most loyal of his followers. Finally, in July 1881, Sitting Bull accepted the inevitable. He could not watch his people starve. Emaciated, impoverished, and defeated, he led his remaining followers back across the border to Fort Buford in Dakota Territory. On July 19, 1881, in a ceremony carefully staged by the Army, Sitting Bull officially surrendered. His young son, Crow Foot, presented Sitting Bull's Winchester rifle to Major David Brotherton, the post commander. Sitting Bull said, "I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle." After his surrender, Sitting Bull was held as a prisoner of war. Instead of being allowed to settle at the Standing Rock Agency where most of his people were, he was held at Fort Randall on the Missouri River for nearly 2 years. The government feared that his presence at Standing Rock would encourage resistance and make it harder to implement their program of forcing the Lakota to give up their traditional ways and adopt American civilization. During his time at Fort Randall, Sitting Bull remained dignified and unbroken in spirit. Though physically he was in poor health, he was held in reasonably comfortable conditions and was allowed to have his family with him. He spent his time in prayer, song, and in teaching his children the old ways. He also began to learn English, though he never became fluent, and he learned to write his name in English. In May 1883, Sitting Bull was finally allowed to move to the Standing Rock Reservation. The reservation was located along the Missouri River, straddling what is now the border between North and South Dakota. It was administered by an Indian agent named James McLaughlin, a man who had married a mixed-blood woman and who believed that the future of Native Americans lay in abandoning their traditional culture and adopting the ways of white American civilization. McLaughlin and Sitting Bull were destined to become antagonists. McLaughlin saw Sitting Bull as an obstacle to progress, a stubborn adherent to the old ways who stood in the way of the Indians' advancement. Sitting Bull saw McLaughlin as yet another representative of the American government that had taken everything from his people. The two men would clash repeatedly over the next 7 years, with McLaughlin doing everything in his power to diminish Sitting Bull's influence, and Sitting Bull stubbornly resisting every effort to change the Lakota way of life. Life on the Standing Rock Reservation was a bitter disappointment for Sitting Bull and his people. They were expected to become farmers, but the land was poor for agriculture, and the Lakota had no tradition of farming. They were expected to send their children to schools where they would be forced to give up their language, their religion, and their culture, and to adopt the ways of white Americans. They were subjected to a corrupt and inefficient administration that often failed to deliver the rations and annuities promised by treaty. They were forbidden to practice their traditional religion, including the sun dance, which was banned by the government. Sitting Bull refused to cooperate with many of these programs. He would not cut his hair, as the authorities demanded. He would not adopt white clothing. He continued to practice his traditional religion, albeit secretly. He spoke out against the government's policies, particularly the effort to force the Indians to take individual allotments of land and give up their communal way of living. He remained a powerful voice for traditional ways, and many of the Lakota looked to him for leadership, much to Agent McLaughlin's frustration. In 1885, Sitting Bull had a strange interlude in his life when he joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Buffalo Bill Cody, the famous scout and showman, was creating a touring spectacle that purported to show scenes from the Old West, including Indian attacks on stagecoaches, buffalo hunts, and demonstrations of marksmanship. Cody wanted to add authenticity to his show by hiring actual Indians, and he particularly wanted Sitting Bull, whose fame after the Battle of the Little Bighorn made him the most famous Indian in the world. Agent McLaughlin, seeing an opportunity to get Sitting Bull away from the reservation, gave permission for him to join the show. For 4 months in 1885, Sitting Bull toured with Buffalo Bill, appearing in cities across the United States and Canada. He was billed as the Slayer of Custer, though in reality he had not personally killed Custer. Audiences came to see him, some out of curiosity, some out of respect, some out of a morbid fascination with the famous savage. Sitting Bull earned $50 per week, a substantial sum at the time, plus a signing bonus of $125. But he was troubled by what he saw during his travels. He saw the vast cities of the East, the unlimited numbers of white people, the wealth and power of American civilization. He realized more fully than ever before how hopeless military resistance had been. He also saw the poverty in American cities, the homeless children begging in the streets, and he was struck by the greed and selfishness he observed in white society. He gave away most of the money he earned to the poor children he encountered, saying that white people knew how to make money, but did not know how to share. After 4 months, Sitting Bull left the show and returned to Standing Rock. He had found the experience degrading and had tired of being gawked at like a curiosity. He returned to his cabin on the Grand River, on the reservation, and resumed his life as a traditional Lakota, living simply, providing what leadership he could to his people, and resisting the government's programs of forced assimilation. The late 1880s were increasingly difficult times for the Lakota people. The buffalo were extinct. The last great herds had been slaughtered in the early 1880s. Without the buffalo, the traditional way of life was impossible. The government continued to reduce the rations provided by treaty, forcing more and more pressure on the Indians to adopt farming. But the land and climate made farming extremely difficult. Drought, crop failures, and disease added to the misery. A measles epidemic swept through the reservation in 1889, and whooping cough followed. Children died in appalling numbers. In 1889, the government made another attempt to break up the Great Sioux Reservation. The Black Hills had already been taken in 1877, in clear violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty, which required the signatures of 3/4 of adult male Indians for any land cession. Now the government wanted to break up the rest of the reservation into smaller reservations and open the land in between to white settlement. Another commission was sent to negotiate the land cession. Sitting Bull opposed this land sale vigorously. He spoke at council meetings, arguing that the land was all they had left and that giving it up would mean the end of the Lakota as a people. He reminded people of the many broken promises and treaties, but the government commissioners were clever. They went to each small community on the reservation, holding separate councils, using a combination of persuasion, bribery, and threats to gather the necessary signatures. They promised that the reduced reservations would be permanent and that the Lakota would receive better treatment if they agreed. They also implied that if the Indians did not agree to the sale, the land would be taken anyway, and they would receive nothing. In the end, the commissioners got enough signatures, though they almost certainly did not get the 3/4 required by treaty. The agreement was sent to Congress, and in 1889, the Great Sioux Reservation was broken up. The Lakota found themselves on 6 smaller reservations: Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Lower Brule, Crow Creek, Pine Ridge, and Rosebud. 9 million acres of the best land were open to white settlement. The breaking up of the reservation was a crushing blow to the Lakota, and it came at a time when they were already in desperate straits. The winter of 1889 to 90 was particularly harsh, and conditions on the reservations were terrible. It was in this context of despair and desperation that a new religious movement swept through the Lakota people: the Ghost Dance. The Ghost Dance had originated with a Paiute prophet named Wovoka in Nevada. Wovoka had experienced a vision during a solar eclipse in 1889. In his vision, he was taken to the spirit world, where he saw all the dead people living happily. God told him that if the Indians would live in peace, give up alcohol, and perform a certain dance, the dead would return, the buffalo would come back, the white people would disappear, and the Indians would reclaim their lands. The world would be renewed, and the Indians would live as they had in the old days. This millenarian message spread like wildfire across the western reservations. For people who had lost everything and saw no hope in the present, the promise of a miraculous restoration of their world was irresistibly appealing. Delegations from various tribes traveled to Nevada to meet Wovoka and learn the dance. Among these were several Lakota, including Kicking Bear and Short Bull, who returned to the Lakota reservations in March 1890 with the new teachings. The Lakota adapted the ghost dance to their own beliefs and circumstances. The dance itself was simple. Participants would join hands in a large circle and dance, often for hours or days at a time, singing songs and praying. As they danced, some would fall into trances and experience visions of the spirit world, seeing dead relatives and the old way of life restored. The Lakota added the concept of ghost shirts, specially decorated shirts that they believed would make them invulnerable to bullets. The ghost dance spread rapidly across the Lakota reservations in the fall of 1890. Hundreds, then thousands of people took up the dance. The authorities were alarmed. They saw the ghost dance as a dangerous movement that could lead to an uprising. Agent McLaughlin at Standing Rock was particularly concerned about Sitting Bull's involvement. Sitting Bull's initial response to the ghost dance was cautious. He was skeptical of the prophecy that the dead would return and the white people would disappear. He had seen too much of the white man's power to believe they would simply vanish. But he was also sympathetic to the spiritual needs of his people, and he believed in the importance of traditional religious practices. When some of his people wanted to take up the ghost dance, he gave his permission for them to do so. He may have even participated himself in some of the dances, though accounts differ on this point. For Agent McLaughlin, this was the final straw. He had been trying to diminish Sitting Bull's influence for years, and now he saw an opportunity to remove him permanently. He reported to his superiors that Sitting Bull was the leader of the ghost dance movement on Standing Rock, and that he was planning an outbreak. This was an exaggeration at best. Sitting Bull was not the leader of the movement, and there is no evidence that he was planning any violence. But McLaughlin's reports created alarm in Washington and in the Army. In late November 1890, the Army took control of the Lakota agencies from the Civilian Indian Bureau. General Nelson Miles, who had pursued Sitting Bull relentlessly after the Little Bighorn, was in command of the Department of the Missouri. Miles ordered that the leaders of the ghost dance movement be arrested and removed from the reservations. On Pine Ridge Reservation, this led to the flight of some ghost dancers into the Badlands, creating a tense standoff. At Standing Rock, McLaughlin planned for the arrest of Sitting Bull. McLaughlin wanted to use Indian police to make the arrest, believing that using soldiers would create more resistance. The Indian police were recruited from the progressive Indians on the reservation, those who had adopted white ways and who resented Sitting Bull's influence. McLaughlin planned carefully, waiting for the right moment. That moment came in mid-December, when reports suggested that Sitting Bull was planning to leave Standing Rock and travel to Pine Ridge to join the ghost dancers there. On December 15, 1890, just before dawn, 43 Indian police, led by Lieutenant Bull Head, surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin on the Grand River. They burst into the cabin and arrested Sitting Bull, who was sleeping. They told him he was to come with them to the agency. Sitting Bull, now about 60 years old, agreed to go, but said he needed to dress. As he was dressing and preparing to leave, his followers began to gather outside the cabin. The word spread quickly that Sitting Bull was being arrested, and soon over 150 of his supporters had surrounded the cabin. The situation grew tense. Sitting Bull's followers shouted at the police, calling them traitors and cowards for serving the white man against their own people. They urged Sitting Bull not to go. Catch the Bear, one of Sitting Bull's most loyal followers, shouted that they should not let the police take him. The police began to drag Sitting Bull from the cabin toward a horse. As they emerged into the cold December morning, the crowd pressed closer. What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds. Catch the Bear raised his rifle and shot Bullhead, the police lieutenant, in the side. Bullhead, as he fell, turned and shot Sitting Bull in the chest. Another policeman, Red Tomahawk, simultaneously shot Sitting Bull in the back of the head. Sitting Bull fell, killed instantly. Then a general melee erupted. Shots were fired wildly. When the shooting stopped, 8 of Sitting Bull's followers were dead, including Sitting Bull's 17-year-old son, Crow Foot, who had been shot after being dragged from the cabin. 6 policemen were dead or mortally wounded. Sitting Bull died in front of his cabin, on the reservation he had resisted going to, killed by Indian police in the employ of the government he had fought against all his life. His body was taken to Fort Yates, where he was buried in a corner of the post cemetery in an unmarked grave. The authorities wanted no shrine that might become a gathering place for resistance. Sitting Bull's death sent shockwaves through the Lakota reservations. Many of his followers fled, fearing that they would be next. Some of them joined with a band of Miniconjou Lakota under Chief Bigfoot, who were traveling to Pine Ridge Reservation seeking peace and shelter. On December 29, 1890, just 2 weeks after Sitting Bull's death, the 7th Cavalry intercepted Bigfoot's band at a place called Wounded Knee Creek. The soldiers attempted to disarm the Indians. A shot was fired, whether by an Indian or a soldier is unclear, and the soldiers opened fire with rifles and Hotchkiss guns. In the massacre that followed, more than 200 Lakota men, women, and children were killed. The bodies, frozen in the bitter cold, were later thrown into a mass grave. Wounded Knee marked the final military encounter between the Lakota and the United States Army. It was a brutal conclusion to the long struggle for the plains. Sitting Bull was gone, but his legacy was just beginning to take shape. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the government tried to portray him as a dangerous renegade who had gotten what he deserved. Agent McLaughlin wrote reports, and later a book presenting Sitting Bull as a cowardly, treacherous man who had held his people back from the benefits of civilization. But others saw him differently. Even some Army officers who had fought against him expressed admiration for his courage and his unwavering defense of his people. As the decades passed, the truth about Sitting Bull's life became more widely known. He came to be seen not as a violent savage, but as a patriot who had fought to defend his people and their way of life against overwhelming odds. He had never signed a treaty that he did not believe was just. He had never surrendered until there was no other option. He had lived according to the values of his culture: courage, generosity, wisdom, and spiritual commitment. He had been a voice for resistance, but also for dignity and self-determination. Sitting Bull's spiritual legacy was perhaps even more important than his political one. Throughout his life, he had been a Wicasa Wakan, a holy man, a man in touch with the spiritual powers of the universe. His visions had guided his people in their darkest hours. His example had shown that it was possible to maintain one's identity and values, even in the face of seemingly irresistible pressure to conform and surrender. His refusal to compromise on matters of principle, even when it would have been easier to give in, set a standard of integrity that inspired generations. In his personal life, Sitting Bull had been a man of great warmth and generosity. He loved his children deeply and was devastated by the deaths that came all too often in that harsh time and place. He loved to sing and compose songs. He enjoyed the company of others and was known for his sense of humor. He was generous to a fault, giving away his possessions even when he had little. He cared deeply for the welfare of his people, especially the poor and vulnerable. All his life, he had put the interests of his community above his own comfort or safety. Sitting Bull had also been a man of considerable intellectual depth. Though he had no formal education in the Western sense, he was highly intelligent and thoughtful. He understood the complexities of the situation his people faced. He recognized the overwhelming power of the United States and the impossibility of defeating it militarily in the long run. But he also understood that there were things more important than life itself. Freedom, dignity, the preservation of culture and identity, the right to live according to one's own values, these things were worth fighting for, even if the fight was ultimately doomed. In many ways, Sitting Bull's life encapsulated the entire experience of the Plains Indians in the 19th century. He had been born into a world where his people were free, powerful, and living according to traditions that had sustained them for generations. He had witnessed the arrival of overwhelming numbers of outsiders who wanted the land and resources his people depended on. He had seen the buffalo disappear, the sacred places desecrated, the promises broken, the children dying of disease and starvation. He had fought against this destruction with all his strength and courage, but in the end, he had been unable to stop it. And yet, Sitting Bull had not been defeated. Not really. He had lost the physical struggle, but he had won the moral one. He had maintained his integrity, his commitment to his values, his concern for his people, until the very end. He had shown that it was possible to resist, to refuse to give in, to maintain one's identity even in the face of overwhelming pressure. This was perhaps his greatest legacy. In the years following his death, as the Lakota people struggled to survive on the reservations, dealing with poverty, disease, and the continued assault on their culture, Sitting Bull became a symbol of resistance and pride. His image appeared on posters and postcards. Books were written about him, some accurate, many sensationalized. He became, in many ways, the face of Native American resistance to American expansion. The 20th century brought slowly improving conditions for Native Americans, though the progress was uneven and often painfully slow. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 ended the policy of forced allotment and allowed tribes to reorganize their governments. The American Indian movement of the 1960s and 1970s brought renewed pride in Native American identity and renewed demands for justice. Throughout these struggles, Sitting Bull remained an inspiration, a reminder of the courage and dignity of the ancestors. In 1953, Sitting Bull's remains were moved from Fort Yates to a more prominent grave site near Mobridge, South Dakota, overlooking the Missouri River. The grave is marked by a simple stone monument. It has become a place of pilgrimage for many people, both Native American and non-Native, who come to pay their respects to a man who stood firm in defense of his people and his principles. Today, Sitting Bull is remembered as one of the greatest Native American leaders in history. He is honored not just among the Lakota, but among all Native peoples, and indeed by many non-Native Americans as well. His image has appeared on postage stamps. His name is known around the world. He has been the subject of countless books, films, and documentaries. Schools, parks, and even a college have been named in his honor. But perhaps the most important way Sitting Bull is remembered is in the oral traditions of the Lakota people. The stories of his courage, his visions, his generosity, his songs, his unwavering commitment to his people. These stories are still told around kitchen tables and at gatherings on the reservations. Parents tell their children about Sitting Bull so that they will know where they come from, so that they will understand the price that was paid for their survival, so that they will have a model of courage and integrity to guide them in their own lives. The world that Sitting Bull fought to preserve is gone. The buffalo are no longer the center of life. The free-roaming existence on the plains is a memory preserved in stories and ceremonies. The Lakota people live in a very different world now, a world of pickup trucks and smartphones, of jobs and schools, of basketball and rodeos. But the values that Sitting Bull embodied, courage, generosity, wisdom, spiritual commitment, concern for community, and unwavering integrity, these values remain relevant. These values continue to guide the Lakota people as they navigate the complexities of the modern world while maintaining their identity as a distinct people with a unique culture and history. Sitting Bull's life raises profound questions that remain relevant today. What do we owe to our ancestors? What are we willing to sacrifice to preserve our values and identity? How do we maintain our dignity and integrity in the face of overwhelming power? How do we balance the need for survival with the need to remain true to ourselves? These are not just questions for Native Americans, but for all people everywhere who face challenges to their way of life, their values, their identity. In our modern world, where globalization and cultural homogenization threaten local cultures and traditions everywhere, Sitting Bull's example has a universal resonance. He showed that it is possible to resist cultural annihilation, to maintain one's identity, to refuse to surrender one's values, even when the odds seem impossible. He showed that there is dignity in resistance, that there are things worth fighting for beyond mere physical survival, that a life lived with integrity and courage, even if it ends in defeat, is more meaningful than a life of comfortable surrender. Sitting Bull also reminds us of the terrible cost of colonialism and expansion. His story is part of a much larger story of indigenous peoples around the world who have faced the same pressures, the same violence, the same attempts at cultural annihilation. From the Aboriginal peoples of Australia to the indigenous peoples of the Americas to the tribal peoples of Africa and Asia, the story has been remarkably similar. The arrival of more powerful outsiders, the taking of land and resources, the spread of disease, the use of military force to suppress resistance, the attempts to destroy indigenous cultures and replace them with the culture of the colonizers. In telling Sitting Bull's story, we must not romanticize the past or present the Plains Indians as perfect or their way of life as idyllic. Like all human societies, they had their flaws and problems. Warfare was common, life was hard, infant mortality was high, and the status of women, while different from that in Victorian American society, was constrained in its own ways. But it was their society, evolved over generations to fit their environment and their needs. They had a right to live according to their own values and traditions, a right that was trampled by American expansion. We must also acknowledge the complexity of the individuals involved in this history. Not all Americans who moved west were motivated by greed or hatred. Many were ordinary people looking for better lives for themselves and their families. Soldiers like Custer were products of their time and place, shaped by the values and assumptions of their culture. Indian agents like McLaughlin genuinely believed they were helping Native Americans by trying to assimilate them into American civilization, unable to see that their own cultural assumptions were not universal truths. Even the Indian police who killed Sitting Bull were men trapped in an impossible situation, forced to choose between their jobs and their loyalty to their own culture. And yet, for all this complexity, there remains a fundamental injustice at the heart of this history. Treaties were made and broken. Promises were given and violated. A people who had lived on the land for generations were dispossessed of that land. A culture that had sustained a people for centuries was actively suppressed and nearly destroyed. Sitting Bull recognized this injustice and refused to accept it. That is why he matters. That is why his story continues to resonate. As we reflect on Sitting Bull's life in the quiet of this evening, we might consider what lessons we can draw from his example. In a world that often seems to value compromise and accommodation above all else, Sitting Bull reminds us that there are some things that should not be compromised. In a world that often measures success in material terms, Sitting Bull reminds us that there are values more important than wealth or comfort. In a world where cultural identity is under pressure everywhere from the forces of homogenization, Sitting Bull reminds us of the importance of maintaining our distinct identities and traditions. But perhaps most importantly, Sitting Bull reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite everything that was done to him and his people, despite the military defeats, the starvation, the disease, the cultural suppression, the betrayals, Sitting Bull maintained his dignity and his commitment to his values until the very end. He showed that it is possible to remain unbroken in spirit even when broken in body, to maintain hope even in the darkest circumstances, to continue to care for others even when one's own situation is desperate. The Lakota people survived, against all odds. Today, there are more Lakota than there were in Sitting Bull's time. The language is still spoken, though it is endangered. The ceremonies are still performed, though they were banned for generations. The values that Sitting Bull embodied are still taught to children. The culture has changed, inevitably, but it has not died. It has adapted, evolved, found ways to persist in a world very different from the one Sitting Bull knew. This survival is perhaps the ultimate vindication of Sitting Bull's life and struggle. As we come to the end of our time together tonight, thinking about Sitting Bull's life, we might imagine him in his final years, living in a simple cabin on the Standing Rock Reservation, an old warrior far from the days of freedom on the plains. He would wake early, as he always had, and step outside to greet the morning, to pray and sing to the rising sun. He would tend to his horses, for the Lakota never lost their love of horses even after the buffalo were gone. He would visit with his family and friends, sharing stories of the old days, teaching his grandchildren the ways of his people. He would look out over the land, now divided by barbed wire fences, dotted with the frame houses that the government insisted the Indians live in. And he would remember how it once was. He would remember the vast herds of buffalo, the camps stretching along the rivers, the freedom of moving with the seasons, the sound of drums and songs at the sun dance, the faces of the many friends and relatives who had died over the years. He would feel the weight of all that had been lost, but he would also feel the presence of the sacred, for Sitting Bull never lost his spiritual connection, never stopped believing that there was meaning and purpose to existence beyond the material. He would feel the presence of his ancestors, the spirits who watched over the people. He would feel hope that somehow, in ways he could not foresee, his people would survive and continue. He would feel love for his children and grandchildren, determination to pass on to them everything he could of the old ways, so that something of the Lakota culture would survive into the future. And so he lived, day by day, maintaining his dignity, refusing to give in to despair, providing what leadership and guidance he could to his people, until that cold December morning in 1890 when his life ended. He died as he had lived, standing firm in his convictions, refusing to compromise on matters of principle, willing to sacrifice everything for what he believed was right. Tonight, more than a century after his death, Sitting Bull's spirit lives on. It lives on in the Lakota people, who continue their journey as a nation. It lives on in the stories that are still told about him. It lives on in the hearts of all people who value courage, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It lives on as an inspiration and a challenge, asking us what we are willing to stand up for, what we believe is worth fighting for, what kind of legacy we want to leave for those who come after us. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you might think about this remarkable man, Sitting Bull Tatanka Ayotanka, the buffalo bull sitting immovable. Think about his courage, his wisdom, his spirituality, his generosity, his love for his people. Think about the world he lived in, so different from ours and yet facing challenges that are not entirely unfamiliar. Think about the values he embodied and how they might apply to our own lives, our own challenges, our own search for meaning and purpose. Let his story remind you that one person, standing firm in their convictions, can make a difference. Let his example inspire you to maintain your own integrity, to stand up for what you believe is right, to care for others, to maintain your connection to what is sacred, to live with courage and generosity. Let his memory honor all those who have struggled for freedom, dignity, and the right to live according to their own values and traditions. And as you rest, let the spirit of the Great Plains come to you in your dreams, the endless grasslands waving in the wind, the vast sky arching overhead, the buffalo moving in great herds across the land, the sound of drums and songs, the courage and dignity of a people who loved their land and their way of life, and who fought to preserve it. Let Sitting Bull's story be a bridge between past and present, a reminder of where we have been and a guide to where we might go. May you sleep well, and may the lessons of Sitting Bull's life stay with you. May you find in his example the inspiration to live your own life with courage, integrity, and compassion. May you remember that the struggle for justice and dignity never ends, that each generation must take up the cause in its own way, and that the example of those who came before us can light our way forward. Good night, and may you find peace in the knowledge that, though much has been lost, much also endures, and that the human spirit, when grounded in courage and love, is ultimately undefeatable. The story of Sitting Bull is not just a story of the past, but a living story that continues to speak to us today, reminding us of what it means to be fully human, to live with purpose and meaning, to stand firm in our values, and to care for those who depend on us. May his memory be eternal, and may his example continue to inspire generations yet unborn.